Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our additional panellists. So going from this end, we've got Tom Ash, who's Senior Policy Officer at the Wildlife and Countryside Link, Chris Ranford, who's Chief Executive of the Cornish Fish Producers Organisation, Peter Barham, who's Chair of the Seabed User and Developer Group, and Samuel Roble, who's Senior Marine Policy Officer at the RSPB. So you can see we've got a very diverse lineup here. And the question we're going to ask each of them to address first is just simply the biggest one that we are addressing today. Can we meet the 2030 target while growing a sustainable blue economy? I think I'll start at this end with Tom, if that's okay.
Sure. I think the starting point for that question has to be that nature in the last few decades has been pummeled. We are a long way off 30 by 30. We are a long way from good environmental status, and the pressures have piled up. And what we're looking at up to 2030 is potentially more pressures, not fewer. Offshore wind is scaling up, and other industries are not looking to scale down. So how do we manage that? I think with increased focus on offshore wind, we have got a moment when there is an opportunity to change how we do things. But that really has to be a transformative change and focus on restoring nature and not just managing the further decline of nature. But that's not going to happen if we just do the status quo or if we let the market decide things. We really need big intervention from government to plan things strategically, manage those pressures and reduce those pressures while we scale up renewables, or we won't meet those 2030 nature targets.
Thank you very much. Chris.
Thanks. 2030 targets from a fishing industry's point of view, I think no doubt a challenge, but the fishing industry loves a challenge, certainly from Cornwall, so challenge accepted. And I guess just to set some context in relation to the talks that have already happened and the whole idea of the 2 days. From a fishing industry's point of view, with the new Labour manifesto, there's absolutely no mention of fishing whatsoever. So from our point of view, that's extremely challenging to start with and kind of crazy in a way that we haven't been picked up. Given all the detail that we're talking about today and all the ambition for the marine space, to miss fishing out is certainly going to set a bigger challenge than we had already. To second that, I'll get the doom and gloom out of the way and I'll come on something a bit more interesting. Fishing's actually not a statutory consultee, so it doesn't actually have to be consulted in the marine planning process. Spoken a lot about fishing this morning. Great to hear it being spoken about by so many different people in so many different ways. But actually, from a formal point of view, it doesn't have to be recognised in that planning process. Its input doesn't have to be accepted. Things can happen without listening to it. So again, a big challenge. On to something a bit more interesting or positive from a Fisheries Act, Joint Fisheries Statement, 2 really important pieces of legislation and a sort of framework, really. Post-Brexit, there is good recognition of the role of fishing, fisheries management plans, the role and contribution fishing can make to coastal communities. Obviously, it's a food production industry. Lots of good recognition in there, so that's certainly something we're latching onto and working with. We're hearing the Secretary of State making a lot more reference to food security as national security, and our conversations with the Minister in terms of food security is that fishing is very much a part of that. So again, that's something really positive that we can get behind. Cornwall last year produced 40 million meals from seafood, 40 million protein portions, shall I say. That's enough to feed every single person in the entire southwest population one seafood meal every week for an entire year. So I think we make a good contribution to food security. But from our point of view, rather than worry or sort of see where we're not included or not recognised in the manifesto, we're doing a lot of work. So through my organisation, we've collected a huge amount of evidence, a huge amount of data. Fishermen have an immense amount of knowledge, experience, generational understanding of the sea and the marine space. And actually, I think to get to 2030 targets, that's going to have to be listened to. It's going to have to be accepted. That sort of voice is going to be integral in terms of getting to where we want to get to in such a short amount of time. And 2 really quick snapshot examples of that. Our work that we've done in reference to Jamie's presentation about the Crown Estate, working with fisheries. We've been heavily involved in everything that's happening in the Celtic Sea in terms of floating offshore wind. And I think we're sort of revolutionising really how that can play out by bringing fishing in right at the start of the process in terms of marine planning, not waiting for it to get too late or get in the hands of a consultant or a developer. It's actually having that conversation very early on, using our knowledge, our data to smooth that process through. We'll probably definitely get to where we want to get to a lot quicker that way. And there's lots of work we're doing in terms of fisheries management plans, certainly from a Cornish point of view, really engaging and taking that head on and bringing through some of the first bits of legislation post-Brexit, which is all co-designed, as we've been speaking about today. But I would say industry is actually leading a lot of that. A lot of the good things that are coming through are coming out of the words of fishermen themselves. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Peter.
I've been told to use this one.
Go ahead.
Okay, it works. Hi, I'm not Jane Godwin. She's giving evidence to the Environment Audit Committee, so you've got me instead. The answer to the question, can we meet the 2030 targets whilst growing a sustainable blue economy? And the answer is yes. Because if we weren't optimistic, we'd be planning to fail. So it's as simple as that. To expand on that a bit, I've decided to use some of the quotes from the conference so far today, because I think that reflects that we know what the answers are. All we might need to do is work on them. So the first one, and the obvious one, is from Minister Hardy this morning, who said, quote, "We need to be supporting growth and nature." So we do need to worry about bats and newts, and also every other bit of biodiversity. Michelle Willis followed that with a statement where she said, we need to see regulators as enablers, and Siobhan followed through a bit on that, which is great, because the simple fact is that we need to work together, and I don't need to say anything more about participation and collaboration and partnership. It's all been said, not just this morning, but in previous conferences for years and years. But one of the key points, and it's a point that we've recognised at this conference in the last couple of years, and it's really made by Amy and others, Amy Pryor and others in the panel discussion, which is that we need to act, and we need to act now. We have a biodiversity crisis, we have an energy crisis. If it was an energy question, we could say, well, we've got time to look at it. But it's not, it's an energy crisis, we need to act. So there we go. But the simple fact is we're not going to address things like climate change without industry. That's apparent and it's obvious. And equally, industry is very supportive, certainly the marine industries within SUDG, of contributing to nature restoration. And there's a lot going on there. And there's a lot of initiatives, and one of which I think was mentioned this morning by the Minister and announced later on, which is the move towards strategic compensation and the Marine Recovery Fund, which industry will pay for. And that's great. That's actually now public. We got the email this morning, so that's a good news. And the other one is that we're also working very closely with DEFRA, but also RSPB, Wildlife Trust and so on, to develop strategic targets for net gain and how those can be delivered. So there's two real key areas where industries can contribute to nature recovery. Jamie said in his talk, in one of his slides, there's a lovely quote, it said, nature is at the core of decisions, which it should be. I don't think anybody would argue that, and we're working towards this. And Siobhan, you said we work towards strategic, not piecemeal approaches. In other words, we're all saying the same things. All we've got to do is agree them and then act on them. And my last point is the fact that to enable us to act, we've got initiatives. The one I'm particularly thinking of is OWEC, the Offshore Wind Evidence for Change Programme with the Crown Estate, where it's not just looking for evidence, but it's looking for actions arising from those evidence. And most important of all is that all those have an impact. And if we do that, then we will make decisions and we should reach those targets. And I said all that without using the word integrate once.
Thank you very much, Peter. And last but not least, Sam.
Yes is my answer, because we have to. I'm trying to share the optimism of today, and I think a lot of those answers are coming forward in everyone's talk so far, and as we've been kind of plucked on all of those key bits just then by Pete, the answers are there in front of us. But we have to be transformative. We have to see huge scale change, and we have to have that matched ambition for that nature emergency, as we have got for these other emergencies and these other crises coming forward. And that's starting to come forward. We saw that with some of the announcements this morning, and that's an inkling of what is possible in that space, I think. But it's about how do we front load that system? How do we bring those environmental considerations to the forefront of what we're trying to do? It comes into the heart of things, as Jamie was saying. How do we bring that to where we need it, and how do we deal with that as a whole picture? We've never known now, we've never known as much as we do now. We're at a point of absolute as much knowledge as we're going to get. We've got lessons learned. We know when wind farms have been put in bad places. We know when we've put too much emphasis on compensation measures that aren't delivering. We've got the best available knowledge, and we were talking that about in the first session this morning. We have the best available knowledge that we have now, so let's use it. Let's start implementing that and start driving that for action. I think key for 2030, this is a really exciting year. 5 years, I don't know where 2020 went. We're already halfway through that. But key for 2030 is recovery. And I really want to try and emphasize that over the next couple of days. It's not just about protection. We have been declining for decades. If we limit ourselves to protection, we flatline at the bottom. We now need to drive recovery and push that forward. Things like strategic compensation are valuable and really important tools for that consenting and moving us forward and enabling and seeing nature as an enabler in that space. But it gets us back to the baseline. So how do we keep driving that forward and bring that up? And I think seabirds are a really key example of that. And we often get asked, why should we care about seabirds? Why should we care about seagulls? But the answer is they are poignant to this question. Can we hit those targets? They are highest risk of extinction, and they are the furthest from target. They are the only indicator of good environmental status that is not only failing, but moving the opposite direction. And they are our indicators. They're the canary in the coal mine. They're the ones saying, the fact that they're failing, the food systems are failing, the prey availability, the habitats that all of those species rely on are failing, and we have an ecosystem collapsing underneath them. Let's listen to that and drive that forward. And lastly, it's kind of on these points around how Siobhan kind of finished up there. I think the language around trade-offs, the language around barriers is really harmful to how we can progress this. We're on about enablers. How do we push this forward? How do we use what we've got to drive this? And I think that's how we catalyze on this change and use a new attitude towards that of catalyzing change for healthy resiliencies.
Thank you very much. So we've heard violent agreement from 7 extremely different panellists that, yes, we want to meet the 2030 targets, and yes, we want to support a blue economy, and we can, subject to a really long list of conditions and things that have to be true. I hear radical collaboration being top of the list of those things, so thinking very differently about how we work together as a kind of wide range of organisations to get that change. And also systems. I liked what Lucy said about we need to work in a much more systems approach way in order to do this. So I think before going to audience questions, I've got one question, which is what, and this is for any of the panellists who would like to answer it, what one single thing can we do differently now that will unlock radical collaboration and systems change in order that we can deliver that? Jamie.
For me, we don't spend enough time in the same room. So we have a good breadth of expertise in this room, a lot of people, but quite often we find ourselves in more bilateral conversations. Bilateral with government, bilateral with a developer, or bilateral with somebody who has another interest in the marine space, and round we go. So for me, if we could spend a little bit more time really focusing on some of those issues, collaboratively as in across government, across industry, across stakeholders, across organisations like the MMO, organisations like ourselves, I think that would allow us to be a bit quicker in what we're trying to achieve.
Lucy.
I just wanted to build on what Jamie was saying, because I was going to say something similar, but make it a bit more focused on developing a shared vision of what we want the seas to look like. Because often if you have that conversation with everyone in the room and say, well, actually, what does everyone want here? What are we willing to accept? And then design a vision of what if you call it the blue economy or whatever it might be, what does that vision of ocean sustainability look like? I think using that as a focus of the conversation and getting everyone in the same room would be a kind of a quick win and just start the conversations that we need to have. So.
Anyone else?
I just think we've done a lot. This isn't something that's about to happen. It's not all in the future. We've done so much, and there's so many lessons learned. I think it's just a really important time to quickly reflect and actually then learn from the past and actually see what we can do in this immediate future. Feels like there's an urgency, no doubt about it. But this is happening today, this is happening yesterday. Certainly from my point of view, there's huge lessons learned from past experiences in terms of the Crown Estate and the fishing industry. And that's what we're trying to do, is actually really try and shift things around. But I think across everything, we do need to learn lessons from where we've come from.
Tom.
I think 2025 has to be the year of policy implementation, especially policies that many of us agree on. I mean, we've worked closely with SUDG on planning reform, and there's been so many things mentioned by the previous government and now again by this government, and we heard that from Member Hardy this morning about marine spatial prioritization, Marine Recovery Fund, and they've just been on paper for so many years. And if we don't have many of those things in place by the end of 2025, then we're not going to get to 2030. So I think we all need to keep asking for that to make sure that government hears that message that, yes, there might be room for more strategies at some point, but the priority now is implementation, number one.
I can't add to that.
Fantastic. Right, let's go to questions out here. David, do you want to come first? David's got the Slido questions, but needs a microphone as well. Can we take two from your Slido questions?
There's a lot of questions here about directly to the Crown Estate. So I think they've been upvoted quite a lot, so we need to address those, I think. So I'll just read out two, and then there's groups here around ownership, another group around planning, but I'll stick to the ownership first. How can truly democratic and community-driven local decision-making be possible if 55% of the shoreline is the property of one owner? And just to follow on from that around ownership, the Crown Estate owns 65% of the Welsh seabed, providing millions in annual revenue. Wales doesn't receive this. Is it time to devolve the Crown Estate in Wales? No personal interest there at all.
Thank you for those questions.
Who wants to take this one? Thanks, Dave. So, I saw the questions on Slido, actually. And I think, just as an observation, I think if we can capture the question on Slido, I don't know if we can or not, but then really happy to take some of these away as well. But for the two there, in terms of the slight monopoly ownership of the coastal area, I think it depends on how open your landowner is to the conversations and what also we have customers at the Crown Estate, we have tenants, and what the tenants are using that land for. So we grant rights for lots and lots of things in the offshore and coastal space. I think we are very clear in our strategy from our board all the way down through our business into our marine business that we want to operate in a way that considers all forms of value. It needs to be collaborative. It needs to be done. Our business needs to be done in a way that doesn't just think about the money that we return back to Treasury. So I think if we approach that in the right way and we instill that mindset in the right way in our tenants and our customers, then there is a collective that can come to the table that can have those more community-based conversations. So that's what I think about the first question. In terms of the devolution question, so we returned 1.1 billion to the Treasury last year. We have no choice where that goes from us. It goes back into the Treasury, into central government, and then various things happen with devolved nations. So we focus very hard on our remit to make sure that we're, as I said, maximising all forms of value in terms of that return that we make as well. We think equally about the space that we manage across English, Welsh, and Northern Irish waters. We don't favour a particular geography. We try and reflect the needs of policy, the needs of targets, the needs of governments. We try and reflect the way that regulators operate. We're not a regulator ourselves. So it's something that is out of our hands, but we're very focused on making sure we're returning the most value we can so that that value can be spread out in the way that's best.
Thank you. Do any other panellists have views on community participation? Yeah, Lucy.
I was just going to mention, and I'm not trying to support JB's case, but there's also, I'm aware of the work that through the Diverse Values Project, we worked with Tristan a little bit, and I know that the Crown Estate are looking to expand the concept of what value is from a social perspective, so moving away from just revenue, but actually what does prosperity mean for communities, and then asking those questions about how you represent that spatially in planning, which really isn't easy to do, but I think it's quite progressive that they look into that, taking that perspective on things.
Siobhan.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, I think also there's a need for government and the Crown Estate to lead by example in terms of that engagement and engagement with localities as well, because I think that will really add value and demonstrate to other landowners as well that actually, and industry, that actually what we really should be doing is getting those local people involved in those discussions. So I think there's definitely that option to lead by example as well.
Sam?
Yeah, I think questions like that are actually really, really healthy, and I think they should be asked. And sorry, James, I know that is a grilling on your part, but that's what we should be doing. I think business as usual isn't working, and I think questions like that are really healthy, and to question how we do things, and is it the right way, how's it working? And we've seen real good progress with the Crown Estate recently on nature and kind of embedding that, and that's really positive. And I think that sets an example of where they're heading and towards things, and so more questioning like that, I think, is a good thing.
Thank you. Peter?
I mean, Jamie said it all with regard to the money that the Crown Estate collects and puts back to Treasury. I can't add to that. But what I think is important to understand, whether in Wales or England or, as it used to be, Scotland, is that the Crown Estate just doesn't take revenue, it actually invests in industries as well. And that investment is really important in creating growth and in creating jobs and, you know, the whole process of regeneration in coastal communities where we know it's needed. So, and from the social point of view, I think that's a message that needs to be really got across, is that people should rightly have a role to play in their futures, but they need to understand that there are other things going on as well that help to drive that in terms of growth. So I think the Crown Estate play a really important role in that.
Yeah. Chris?
I think whoever the decision maker is on what's happening in terms of marine planning, certainly from a Crown Estate angle, it's all about listening from that local level, that community level. We've got to actually really understand what those voices are saying and what they're telling, because it's not just potentially resistance, it's actually the knowledge and the information those voices hold. Often we get data evidence played back to us as a fishing industry. Somebody else has obtained it, translated it, made an assumption, and then puts it on the table and asks for a conversation, consultation, debate, or whatever. But actually listening to the fishing industry's own translation of that data set, explaining what it's doing, why it's not going to a certain place, its knowledge of the international fishing fleets operating in our waters that might not be on a data set. So I would say, yeah, anyone, whoever is in that position of decision-making power, has to have that deep understanding of what that voice is telling them and actually listen.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to come in?
Nothing to add on that one.
I'm going to try for a question from balcony. Any questions from the balcony? Or is everybody typing their questions into Slido? No? Okay, any questions from the floor in that case? Got one over there. Yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's Bryce Stewart from the Marine Biological Association and the University of Plymouth. Just looking at the big question, and this is for anyone who wants to address this. Do you think there's enough of a common understanding of what the 2030 targets actually mean in reality? And do you think there's a danger that people have different interpretations of that, and that, you know, some groups might claim that we've met the targets? Thinking of MPAs, we've already got 38% in MPAs around the UK. And do you think, therefore, there needs to be more work done to sort of build that common agreement or that common understanding of what we're actually aiming for?
Great question. Any more? I could take a second one from the floor at the same time. One back there. Oh, yeah. Gentleman with his hand up back there.
Thank you. Hitting up the back here. 2 Aussies in a row. What a lucky audience. Wow. So late last week, the Parliament, UK government dropped or didn't vote on the Climate and Nature Bill. Didn't go to a vote. It's a private member's bill. Everyone loves the target. It's kind of like what Bryce is saying, actually. Everyone loves the target. They're in the future. They're a problem to solve over time. But the Climate and Nature Bill is quite interesting in that it proposed legally binding, much more shorter-term milestones and reporting. It promoted a joint nature and climate reporting mechanism. And interestingly, it promoted climate and nature assemblies, citizen assemblies, to help guide those visions, of which one, I won't name him, but a Scottish Conservative member of Parliament described as anti-democratic, which is a quite an interesting take on citizens' assemblies. So what do you think is the significance of this bill going down the plug hole, maybe never to return, since we love targets so much?
Thank you. So two quite big questions. Firstly, do we all agree on what the 2030 success actually looks like? And secondly, does it matter that the Climate and Nature Bill has been put on the shelf for the time being? They're probably quite linked, actually, aren't they? Any views on either of those things? Yes.
Yeah, jumping on that first one, and I think definitely we need to think about more join up across them, and I think of this thing around target fatigue. So many targets. We've had targets for decades, we've missed targets for decades. 2030, a lot of these are building to one point. And it comes back to that point kind of we were talking about earlier around what does good look like? Where are we trying to get to? And actually a vision for that is going to be really beneficial. And Bryce, you mentioned around kind of the MPA target of, I think that is how we're going to unlock that is there is a target for MPAs. There is dispute over kind of how we're meeting that and if we're meeting that and in what, how effective that is. And if we kind of look back to what good looks like, it's how we picture that together. And is it delivering what it needs to do? Because that should be the outcome, not how many, it's what is it delivering and is it working? And that kind of comes back to this, a lot of us in this room talk about the nature and climate emergency, but do we see that reflected in the targets? Do we actually see an energy target reflecting the fact that there is an opportunity to catalyse change to bring them together? And I think that is a really good question because I think that is the bit that needs looking at and it needs raising to the attention at the top of bringing those together.
Peter.
I'm not sure what I think about the nature of the targets. What I do know is that we have a clear set of targets in the sense of what we need to do to achieve good environmental status. And we are working at the moment in a climate where I think we've failed, people will quote better than me, I think we've failed 11 out of 15 descriptors. There is a lot of work to be done. So the target setting, I think, comes from government, through its assessment, through the UK Marine Strategy Programme, strategy work, etc. To that end, if we accept those targets, and I'll take your point about whether we should question them, but if we accept those targets, then there are things we can do to say, well, can we achieve those targets? So the work that, as I said earlier, the work we're currently doing on strategic targets, marine net gain, and the work that Dickon's doing for DEFRA, in setting a framework for marine net gain, is all based around net gain targets achieving GES or contributing towards GES. On the second question, I have always been a big fan of citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies, regardless of whatever Scottish MPs might think. I think they're great examples of local democracy and more power to their elbow, really.
Anyone else? I'll just stray beyond my chair's brief and say there's nothing to stop the existence of citizens' assemblies without legislation, and there's nothing to stop government thinking systemically and thinking about these things together without legislation. So perhaps there's an opportunity to move beyond a possible bit of legislation and just make sure they do it anyway. That's a bit more nimble as well than waiting for legislation to get through the House. Next question, Slido. Oh yes, slide over there.
Another popular question on Slido. What does nature-based solutions mean in relation to offshore development? Can you give an example where nature-based solutions will reduce environmental impacts of development?
Do another one as well.
Sorry. Another question here, really, going back to the planning question with the Crown Estate, although these can be answered by anybody, really. The Crown Estate and the MMO appear to have the same aims and approaches. How does the Crown Estate route map differ from the MMO marine plans? And I suppose in brackets, has a merger been considered?
Shall I pass to the Crown Estate and the MMO first for that second question? Siobhan, do you want to try?
Yes, so I think I'd basically say that we have very different remits in terms of what we're trying to do. So the MMO is it's a statutory marine planner for the UK government. So that's very much what our role is doing. And I'll pass on to Jamie to talk a little bit more about the Crown Estate, but I would very much say that we're working together, but we've got very different and separate remits. But although we work closely together, we are separate. We're doing different things for different reasons with various statutory purposes, but I'll pass to Jamie for anything further.
Yeah, just build that. So, yeah, so MMO, statutory marine planner, regulator, licensing. We are looking at, through the route map, how we then create delivery. So we work in the context of government policy. We're not trying to set policy, that's government. We're not trying to be a regulator, that's not us. We are an organisation that provides and grants space rights to the seabed that allows things to happen. Said we're trying much harder to do that in a much more rounded way in recent times, and the route map is our vehicle to try and do that. What we do share between us, the MMO, NSTA, NISO, all the other organisations that have some sort of formal role in making things happen, is a need for evidence, is a need for information, is a need for good consultation, good partnership. And that's really what we're trying to enable here. So we will work absolutely closely with the MMO and help share the insights that we have from our information. We'll also then listen and take the MMO's outputs and reflect, if stuff comes out in marine planning that we need to reflect in the way that we think about delivery, we'll absolutely do that as well. So very separate remits, and I think that's probably why a merger hasn't been considered.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, with all due credit to great work that both organisations do, I think the question gets at something really important, which is there are a lot of overlapping jurisdictions in the marine space and a lot of different plans and all really great work going on. But it has been a gaping hole in recent years in terms of marine planning, which is central government. And I think the approach taken originally was let the market decide where stuff goes. And it's become clear to everyone, and there's been amazing work to correct that and say that is not the approach we can take, but we still don't have a marine spatial prioritization plan. That's what we need to reconcile these things, because it needs to have, and this is something that no other organization apart from central government can do, is actually have the power to affect decision making. Because unless you've got something that actually has the power to say, right, that goes there, these two can go in the same place, these two can't, it's all really good evidence, but it doesn't have that bite. So I think that's what we're missing to really bring everything together. And that has to talk to everyone. It shouldn't just be government taking that decision by themselves, but we do need that.
Anybody else on this?
Yeah, I guess from a stakeholder point of view, definitely not suggesting a merger, but a simplified process would be welcomed. I mean, I think from a Cornish fishing industry point of view, we're fortunate to be organised through the organisation I work for. There's a good history there of how we engage, how we do things, the wealth of data, evidence that we actually hold there, and the way that we can actually play that back and engage in whatever the process is, whatever the situation is. But certainly as you go further around the coast, there's going to be areas that are going to be much more spread out, fragmented in how they actually engage with both the MMO, the Crown Estate, in terms of all things marine spatial planning, fisheries management. It's a huge ask of either an individual business, a small community. So if there's a way of simplifying that, at least to recognize those people have got jobs to do and they actually need to make a living, as well as then contribute to this big picture thinking, that there's certainly a recognition of that, and we should find a more simplified way to do things.
Peter?
I think they're two very different organisations with different jobs. But what I would say is that work that the Crown Estate have done through the route map, etc., must be of incredible benefit to assisting the MMO in doing its obligation of developing marine plans. It's as simple as that as far as I'm concerned. Do you want me to say something about nature-based solutions?
Give me some examples, thank you.
There's a lot in terms of how you design things, how you construct things, how you carry out compensatory actions to make sure that you reduce the impacts of nature. I've got a lot of personal experience of working in the ports industries to recreate or restore salt marshes and mudflats as compensation for port development, usually in quite large multipliers. But it's whether you see nature as environment or nature. If you mean nature as in nature restoration, then clearly there need to be actions that contribute to nature and restoration. So again, Tom, that's why I would really welcome the ministerial announcement this morning about strategic compensation and the fact that there'll be a marine recovery fund, because that will need to set clear targets that industry can achieve. So that's the straight nature-based. But there's also so many environmental things going on as well. You know, we've got better communications as a result of subsea cables. you know, we've got better transport because of more sustainable shipping and so on and so forth. So if Jen was here, she'd say that there's a variety of ambitions for improving things through the way that industry works, but there are great examples of nature-based solutions.
Tom?
Yeah, just on that, I think nature-based solutions are fantastic for some things and not so much for others. So you're talking about strategic compensation. I think done in certain ways, not only, and this is of the essence of nature-based solutions, can benefit nature and also people. You know, talked about salt marsh, that can help with storing carbon, flooding, so on. However, some of our member organizations at Link are working on species like cetaceans where there is no compensation. You just simply cannot compensate for damage to cetacean habitats. So then you have to think it's more difficult, but it's just as equally as important because cetaceans are an important part of the ecosystem. They also play a role in circulating nutrients, storing carbon, but you can't compensate. So I think we have to be aware of where we can do a win-win and where it's much more difficult, and we have to think about the first stage of the mitigation hierarchy, which is avoiding those impacts. For example, the work's being done by the government on offshore noise.
I agree entirely with you.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think kind of bringing this back to our question of meeting 2030 targets is, I see a compensation and the role of nature-based solutions in some of those examples really key over the next 5 years. You know, we've got over 90 gigawatts of offshore wind in our planning system, whether that's through consent or planning or all of these extra bits and bobs, which is almost double that 2030 target. I know there are other ways and, you know, other considerations that we have there. But the compensation element, the nature-based solutions, is a real key to enabling that delivery. And I think, as we've been talking about the announcements this morning and things coming forward, it can really see nature as an enabler. It allows the consent of wind farms when it's used in that space. And I think there are some fantastic examples if we're considering the life cycle of species. We don't want to be confined to what's easy. Thinking about, coming back to the question asked for specific examples, if we're thinking about artificial nesting structures for offshore wind farms, we don't yet know if that is a successful compensation measure, and it confines us to that breeding component. Well, let's think beyond that. Think about the islands that they're nesting on, thinking about the colonies, the beach nesting areas, thinking about out at sea, the offshore areas, the food availability. Let's think beyond that, and that's how we piece this together, and that's where we're going to see the wins. It's thinking about, in terms of seabirds and speaking from that experience, they need 3 things: a place to breed, a place to feed, and plenty of food. So if we can combine those, we can see some action and real action for consenting. Beyond 2030, that's where we absolutely need that marine spatial prioritization, that avoidance. That is what is crucial, so that we're not sat here again in 10 years' time going, well, how do we meet the 2040 target? Or, you know, whatever it's going to be. So that's how I see splitting this up and separating it.
Thank you. So I've heard, in terms of specific examples, salt marsh, and I've heard artificial nesting structures. Anyone else with some examples of nature-based solutions and what they actually are? I love that fact that we need to explore this question further in future, I say. There's a gentleman with his hand up just there.
Will Manning from the EA again, and I should have introduced earlier, but I'm the national contact in flood and coastal erosion risk management for the Habitat Compensation Restoration Programme. And for over 20 years, that's been doing strategic compensation, offsetting or compensating for the impact on the Natura 2000 network from coastal squeeze. And Poster 8 is one that we put together for that programme. So there's quite a lot of experience of delivering these big realignments around the coast over the last 20 years, working with a lot of partners in conservation bodies, in industry, regulators working actually in DEFRA, and also willing landowners, which is a big thing that we need to consider here. As Sam rightly pointed out, that compensation is that running to stand still against the 90s baseline set by the HABS regs. So one of the things, taking a leaf out of Peter's book and quoting from earlier, Minister Hardy mentioning transitioning through into co-design and co-delivery. How can that EA's publicly funded habitat compensation programme work with the industry sat on stage and the plans being set out on stage to come together and deliver beyond that compensatory requirement and achieve the wider restoration and recovery aims of the UK government?
Thank you. Let's just do that question. Any views on integrating the EA's existing compensation programme? Lucy.
I don't have a very detailed answer to that specific, but it points to a really broader point that, and I mentioned in my presentation, there's a rapid developing discussion around nature restoration and what we need to do to restore nature. And I've heard in many different arenas now that we need a strategic approach to nature restoration, and they're looking at that in Scotland. Thinking about that from a Welsh perspective, it's coming out of some of the marine net gain work that we're doing, and it's just like we can only look at this in a coordinated way if we've actually got some overarching vision and kind of framework of what we're actually aiming at in terms of recovering the environment and including across the coastline as well. Because I know in Wales we did some work there, and it's not just starting with your marine habitats and to recover those, because actually at the coast they have been doing a lot already on that front for compensation for flood risk. So yeah, all these really important discussions around strategic approaches. It needs to be a really strategic approach to nature restoration across the UK, I think, land and sea.
Peter.
Will, I'm going to try and answer your question without using the word integration. I don't like it. But the simple fact is that we've now had 3 or 4 generations of shoreline management plans, and those really need to be setting out strategic approaches to coastal management, where we should hold the line, where we should retreat the line, so on and so forth. And it's always been my contention, as you know, I was heavily involved with shoreline management plans when I was in the agency. It's always been my contention that we should set those out very clearly, not see managed realignment areas as places for discussion, but for places where we will carry out managed realignment to get better flood defences, and then start to look for industry and others, local authority, government, etc., to act as partners in the delivery of those things. It's a very, to me, it's a very simple, straightforward, strategic solution. But the agency needs to be very clear about where it sees areas for managed realignment, where we can do some serious habitat restoration.
Tom.
Yeah, you'll notice a theme in my answers, which is policies that have gone missing. And another one is marine net gain. If we're thinking about strategic restoration, that has to be a big part of it, because really, if that's done strategically, it could be an enormous amount of money for restoration. And importantly, going beyond, we've heard compensation is just keeping the status quo. That's exactly right. The marine net gain could potentially be taking us beyond that status quo to improving, which is what we need if we're going to hit good environmental status, hit 30 by 30. So that's another policy we need to implement, get it done.
Couldn't agree more. That's exactly what we're trying to do, to set up strategic targets which will help us achieve GES, which will help DEFRA develop their marine net gain policy. As I said earlier on, Dickon's doing some amazing stuff through our marine consultancy on assessment framework for MNG. I couldn't agree more. Net gain should be net gain. It should be restoration and improvement.
Thank you. Slido.
So many speakers have mentioned putting nature at the centre of policy and planning. How does that practically look for marine industries? And I guess we've got 3 people on this panel there who can answer this. But also I think there's a question up in the balcony, I've been told.
Question from the balcony.
It's Martin Kirby from Natural England. I just wanted to just sort of check in with the panel whether we're using the mitigation hierarchy as well as we could, getting towards 2030, because things will go quicker and smoother if we try and avoid the impacts and reduce them and mitigate them before we get to compensation.
Thank you. Those are linked but quite different questions. So let's start with the first one. How do we actually put nature at the centre of policy and planning in the marine environment?
I suppose I better take it.
Go on then.
I think the recognition that nature needs to be at the centre of decision making is in itself a massive move forward. I quoted Jamie, you said that nature has to be at the centre of decision making as a result of all the work we're doing to look at the future of the sea. So I think that in itself is a major step forward. How it's done, we may need to think a bit more about that. But going back to the point in the second question, and also the point that Tom raised, is we have had the mitigation hierarchy in place for many years. Industries are very used to working with the mitigation hierarchy, the regulatory process, and the question came from Natural England. Natural England are, I was going to say integrally involved, I don't want to, are closely involved with the regulatory, they help drive the regulatory process. Close consultation at the pre-application stage with the MMO and others, to look at how we're going to avoid before we mitigate and ultimately compensate. From an industry perspective, avoidance and mitigation is a lot cheaper than compensation. There is a strict route currently in place under the habitat regs through the derogation process for compensation. I know from my own personal experience, it's long, complicated, involves an awful lot of work, an awful lot of time, and in truth, an awful lot of money. So I would say that from an industry perspective, industry does everything it can to work with the mitigation hierarchy because it's better to do so and it's better to avoid. But it doesn't mean the compensation isn't there at the end of the day. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Tom and then Chris.
Yes, I just think this isn't an innovative solution, but hopefully it's popular with the Natural England questioner. I think more funding for statutory nature conservation bodies will be helpful to everyone. It will be helpful to nature because we'll get better advice, and it will be helpful to developers because they can get that advice quicker and they can get better advice which allows planning to progress. We've been saying this for many years, and it seems the Treasury seems to be allergic to that idea. They talk about growth, they talk about what, Rachel Reeves is going out to all the regulators saying, how can you support growth? Or ask not what your nation do for you, what can you do for them? She needs to give them more money if they're going to do their job properly. And yes, that maybe comes to need with innovative processes, and I think that work is going on. But without the money for that consultation to get that nature evidence into a different planning thing, we're just not going to progress.
Chris. Yeah.
So, from a fisheries point of view, I'll give it a little bit of context. Going back a few years, back in 2021, we as the Cornish fishing industry published our own fishing strategy. And number one, the most fundamental thing, this is in-depth engagement with the catching sector, people going to sea, people on shore, harbours, markets, processes, was actually getting a really good understanding about what's happening in our waters. Science is going to be the most fundamental thing to a positive, thriving fishing industry. So actually having good investment, I think, speaking back to Tom's points in terms of making sure there's actually good financial packages there, government support to actually work and use the fishing industry to build the most detailed data sets that we've got about what's happening in our waters, what's changing, and let's apply sensible management on that. I think at the moment still there's this inconsistent approach, this sort of missing overarching aim really about how we're actually managing our fisheries. We've got this whole new way of working through fisheries management plans, co-design, little bits of progress, but it feels a little bit slow still. It feels like we need to get on with it. And then we still have this international process that we go on every year where we decide how much we're going to catch of certain species next year. And that's a big decision made with the EU and ourselves. And they both kind of operate in two different ways of working, which I think then leads to quite inconsistent approaches about how we're managing things in the fishing industry. And I think we need to get those two merged together, or maybe one overarching aim about what does good fisheries management look like and what does a sort of thriving industry look like as well. So yeah, I think back to our original point, or my original point on our fishing strategy and putting that investment, getting a really good understanding and using the fishing industry to build a really detailed data set about what's happening in our waters.
Jamie.
I had just some practical stuff we've been doing at the Crown Estate. So I think there's three things that help us put nature at the centre of decision making. It was my line on the slide earlier. So firstly, we're building the evidence. So when we look at each sector, we obviously try to avoid all the sensitive areas, and that's more like the let's not make it worse type calculation, if you like. But we also then have a totally separate process of building information just about the opportunities for nature. So we partner on that, we get information in from lots of bodies on it, and then we share that information back out. So that means that we can compare any given sector to opportunities for nature totally independently of each other and run scenarios and things. We then help sort our internal processes out. So we have something called a value creation framework that makes sure that when we make decisions, we look at all forms of value. And then the final thing we do is we publish. We now publish that this is our intent, this is what we plan to do, this is what we mean by our nature strategy, putting nature at the forefront of our thinking. Those documents are out. The most recent update was about a week or so ago. And that allows us, again, to collaborate, but hopefully help people also keep us to account. Look, Crown Estate, you said you're going to be thinking like this, you said you're going to be doing like this. And that just helps generate that momentum behind putting nature at the centre.
Thank you. With time in mind, I'm going to attempt to summarise. I think we have heard that, yes, 2030 targets are deliverable alongside a thriving blue economy. We have a lot of data and knowledge and experience, a lot of people who have been doing this, all of this, for a long time. What we need is a direction of travel from the government with a strategic overview and lots of funding for our regulators and offshore environment protectors. I'm sure everybody in the room will agree with all of that. It's enormously challenging, but it's great to hear such a range of perspectives. So many thanks to our fantastic panel.